Really great to have you here today. As Jacqui mentioned, I am the director of CDT's Free Expression Project. Thrilled to see you all today. I am also very grateful to the Future of Free Speech for partnering with us for this event. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panel, moderated by Samir Jain, The View from Congress.
Well, great. Thank you all for being here this morning. My name is Samir Jain. I'm the Vice President of Policy at the Center for Democracy and Technology. I've been here about 3 years, and prior to that, I was both a partner at law firms and also served in the Obama administration, both at the Department of Justice and National Security Council. So I've been in this space about 20, 25 years. We're honored today to have a fantastic panel of folks who work in Congress to join us to talk about what's the view of Congress, from Congress on these issues. There are innumerable bills that are discussing or addressing First Amendment and generative AI issues, or that raise First Amendment issues, and we'll be talking about a number of them, at least in terms of the issue areas. Let me briefly introduce each of our panelists. You can go to their LinkedIn profiles for more detailed information. But on my immediate left is John Beezer, who's a senior advisor with the Senate Commerce Committee and works on the Democratic staff of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection, Product Safety, and Data Security. In addition to his long experience in Congress, John has worked with a variety of early stage tech companies, particularly in the area of content distribution, as well as having multiple patents granted while he was at Microsoft. Next to John is Jacqui Kappler, who's Chief Democratic Counsel for the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Courts, IP, and the Internet. She previously also has held several other positions in the House, and before that was Federal Relations Counsel at the American Association for Justice. And finally, we have Halie Craig, who's the Tech Policy Director for Senate Commerce Committee, where she works with ranking member Senator Ted Cruz. She also has had several previous positions in the Senate and worked for a couple of years on public and product policy at Meta, and before that was at R Street Institute. So we have a great panel with a variety of experiences both in Congress and in industry and other places, so I think they'll provide a really good perspective. So we're gonna just jump in and I'll lead a discussion for a while, and then we'll save the last 15 minutes for audience Q&A. So be thinking of questions and happy to field them as we go toward the end. We'll delve as we go into a number of specific topics on AI and generative AI and the First Amendment. But I wanted to start with a more general question for all three of you, which is, as a general matter, as you're thinking about legislation and hearing from advocates on all sides, what role do First Amendment considerations play in formulating legislation? As long as a bill is not obviously unconstitutional, do members and staff largely leave it for the courts to sort out, or how persuasive is it to argue that a bill would violate the First Amendment? To what degree does that figure into your thinking as you're thinking about particular legislation? Jacqui, let me begin with you and ask you to jump in first.
Yeah, sure. I should start by saying that anything I say is mine and mine alone. It's not reflective of the House Judiciary Committee overall. So I would say that while we do apply the "is this unconstitutional" rubric, I think that whether or not something violates any of the amendments to the Constitution or the Constitution in general is something that we give a lot of thought to. From an intellectual property perspective, there are a series of different proposals in AI talking about a right of publicity, ingestion, other issues, getting into deepfakes, and the question of how do we balance these different rights, the right to not be abused or have your work stolen, with also other people should be allowed to express themselves under the First Amendment. And it's really important as we have these conversations that we think about what rights could we accidentally touch on, even in legislation that isn't per se First Amendment focused.
Halie?
Yeah, I would say it's absolutely top of mind for our team. It's one of the, we're not interested in writing any legislation that gets struck down by the Supreme Court. So I think sometimes there's some hasty drafting in Congress and members, rightfully want to get ahead on an issue, but at the end of the day, if your bill is signed into law and then it's struck down, what was the point of the exercise, right? So I'll give two examples. I mean, we had this whole debate with the TikTok legislation, whether or not that you could just do a straight ban of TikTok. Largely, we had to argue that we were banning conduct and not content in that case, so we'll see what happens with that. And then more recently, our team has been working on banning deepfake nudity, non-consensual pornography. We can talk about that a little bit later, but we really did look to First Amendment jurisprudence when we were crafting that bill, specifically the Miller test and then the Ashcroft case. So it is the first thing we look at when we're drafting bills in this space.
John?
Yeah, well, basically, I think I'm going to do a mashup of the previous two answers. Yes, of course, we take it very seriously. In fact, I might be reading too much into your question, but does it look like we don't?
No.
We take it very seriously when you guys call us up and say, what the hell are you doing? But to echo what Jacqui said, it's well known that when the courts have a tough case, they have to do a balancing act, and they usually come up with a balancing test. We don't do it that formally, but we are also in the situation where we have to strike a balance. I mean, a lot of stuff is easy. Do we want to refund this program that already exists? There are no constitutional issues to be concerned about. But when there are difficult topics for legislation, we're going to have to balance, rights against each other, and that's extremely difficult to do. There are interests almost always on both sides, so it doesn't really matter what you do. You're going to hear from someone who's upset about it. In fact, in terms of having input, I don't believe this has ever happened in my experience, and I might even venture to guess it's never happened at all. But I would love it if civil society called us up and said, "Hey, you know what? We have talked to the people we disagree with. We all sat down and we worked out a compromise. We just want to tell you about it." I would probably fall over if I got that call. But we hear it from all sides, and we're definitely aware. We don't tune it out. We're very aware of it. We have to do a balancing act, and then ultimately we do have the advantage that the courts will correct our work if we get it wrong.
So speaking of the courts, I think a number of us in the room are waiting with bated breath for the Supreme Court to make some important decisions in this area, particularly the net choice cases involving the Florida and Texas content moderation statutes, which have been challenged on First Amendment grounds. So John, let me stay with you. To what degree is Congress paying attention to those cases? How do you think if at all, the court's decision might affect legislation going forward in terms of what Congress might do here?
Excuse me. We're definitely paying attention. I am not one of the Supreme Court geeks who refreshes the browser every minute waiting for the decision to come through. I'm a little more fatalistic. It's going to come through. I am going to read it, and I'm going to deal with it, whatever it is. So we are definitely waiting for those. I agree with the net choice position. There are definitely aspects of what I see as compelled speech in both of those bills. This may be appropriate for later, but there are certain things in those bills that I actually do agree with that I believe are not being contested. I have this pet bill that has been around forever, and I love it, and nobody else seems to. It's the PACT Act, or it's now, there was another PACT Act, so they had to rename it the Internet PACT Act. It's a Thune and Schatz bill, and it basically says, really simplifying things, declare what your content moderation policy is, and then if you violate it, that's an unfair deceptive act or practice. And to me, that seems really simple. It doesn't tell you what your policy has to be. It just says you need to say what it is, and then you need to stick to it. So there's elements of that in both bills. I think the Texas bill, there's some argument, and I think it's before the court, as to whether the reporting requirements are burdensome. And in the Texas bill, I think they might be. But it's entirely possible that when the Supreme Court is done with it, we have two little state versions of the PACT Act, and I could be happy with that.
Halie?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely following them. We're in the same boat as John. We'll see what the court decides. In general, I think the bills kind of point to a broader frustration with social media platforms. I've been on the inside of the content policy team at Facebook, which is what it was called at that point in time. And it's been interesting with Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter. That's a new entrant into the content moderation game, but up until that point, I would say all the big platforms were roughly moderating content the same way with some subtle differences. And so in terms of the speech that would get removed from Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, it was almost all the same stuff. And so there really wasn't competition in the content moderation space for people to have more of a platform. So I think there are rightful frustrations with that. Whether or not those bills can lawfully regulate that and impose that on the platform is a completely different matter, right? I'm just trying to point out that there are frustrations with how COVID-related content was treated, and it is seen as political and partisan, and that is problematic in my view, but that's also a market issue that the platforms have to figure out if they want to keep people coming back to those platforms, right, and providing that opportunity for speech. So we definitely don't want to be going back to a fairness doctrine situation. I think John is right to point out that transparency is also key here. When I was still at Facebook, one of the things we talked about as kind of the future of content moderation was transparency and then user controls, letting people have more autonomy over what they see in their feeds, because it's really hard just to say like, okay, we're going to make this decision for 2 billion people, and to just apply that based on what our small team thinks in California. So controls I'm interested in seeing the future of too.
So this is one area where Congress has acted in the context of having passed Section 230, which generally provides that social media companies and other interactive services aren't liable for the content posted by their users or other third parties. Now, this was passed in 1996, and it now seems like just about everyone in Congress wants to modify, repeal, or sunset, or do something about Section 230, although often for different reasons and with different goals. One issue with the explosion of generative AI that's been the subject of a lot of discussion is whether Section 230 applies to generative AI, or if it does, how it does. One of the original sponsors of Section 230, Senator Wyden, has suggested that he doesn't think it does. Now, Halie, Senator Cruz blocked a unanimous consent request for a bill that would have explicitly made clear that Section 230 doesn't apply to generative AI. At the same time, he's been quite critical of Section 230 for some of the reasons that you had mentioned earlier. So be interested in hearing more about what was his rationale, why did he block the UC request on the generative AI in Section 230?
Sure, and I guess I should clarify as well that Senator Cruz does not support a full repeal of Section 230, and he filed an amicus brief in the Gonzalez case, which his issues with 230, at least based on that brief, are center a lot around how the courts have interpreted 230 and construed liability to be broader than the original statute may have intended, right? So I would definitely look to that if you're interested in his very in the weeds views on 230. But in terms of the bill, I actually printed it out just so I can have it in front of me. His objections were twofold. One was procedure. This was a Commerce Committee bill that was not going through regular order. Something this broad needs to be debated in the committee and subject to an amendment process, and I think John would probably agree with me. The second was the policy piece. The bill was really broadly written such that it could possibly sweep in current content moderation on websites that already rely on artificial intelligence, not so much Gen AI, but there's some Gen AI, like when you're typing in a search and it starts to autofill different search terms, that could be construed as generative artificial intelligence. And so we generally just thought the bill was too broad and would probably have a negative impact on speech because it would affect the way that platforms already are moderating content. And to a degree, content does need to be moderated. Platforms need to be able to take down child pornography as soon as it is uploaded to Facebook. They need to be able to take down terrorist beheading videos because otherwise people aren't going to be using those platforms. So we thought it was too broad. And then in terms of whether or not Gen AI is subject to 230, I think it depends. It completely depends on who's, 230 is about who the publisher is, right? And platforms are not treated as the publisher of the content unless they contribute to the material development of the content. And so Gen AI, if I create something on ChatGPT or Dolly or whatever and upload it to Facebook, I'm the publisher, arguably in that case. So I think it just completely depends on the circumstance, would be my view.
John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. First of all, really want to emphasize that these are my personal opinions. I have been
Also, same here.
That applies across the board, I think. And in particular with Section 230, I think attitudes have changed, and very slowly. Like in 1996, I think it was brilliant. I think it was the right thing. I cheered when we finally got it. There were substantial legal conflicts that were unresolved and in fact had a negative, it worked out that if you didn't moderate, you had no liability, but if you tried to improve the quality of what was on your site, then you did have liability. So it's the incentives were backwards. Something needed to happen. It was a good answer. But over time, I think it has changed very subtly in ways that aren't always obvious. So for me, Section 230 has been this ongoing discussion, and I can't really tell you where anybody is at any one time. And so there's a lot of confusion around there. And I'm recalling an anecdote that I thought was, personally, I might be a geek, but I found this really amusing. It was a little over a year ago when Sam Altman testified for the Judiciary Committee, and Senator Halie seemed to almost threaten him. He was basically saying, how would you like it if we took away Section 230 protection? And it was almost like some kind of veiled threat. And Altman responded with, can't people already sue us? Right? Like, so to Altman, the idea that Section 230 would apply apparently hadn't even occurred to him. Whereas for Halie, it was pretty obvious that anyone in Silicon Valley creating content was protected by Section 230. So in my mind, this was just a very entertaining disconnect between the way the two parties were looking at it. I think I would respond very similar to the way Halie did. It depends on the context. In my mind, there are three sort of categories you need to think about. One is if I'm just using ChatGPT to write some stuff or Stable Diffusion to create some images, and I post them on Instagram, that's just the way it's always been. That's some random person putting content onto a social media network, and the platform itself is protected. So I don't think there's any issue there. I think if someone such as OpenAI creates a chatbot, and the chatbot is capable of, convincingly slandering someone with false information, I don't think they get to hide behind Section 230 for that. If they're doing real harm and it's preventable, or at the very least, there's a substantial risk of it, then I think they need to face liability for that. And so I don't even, based on that conversation I just mentioned, I don't think that the creators of these tools feel that way. There's finally this one sort of gray area, and maybe slightly different opinion on my part than what Halie was saying, where she was saying, if you contribute to the creation of the content, then you do have some liability as a platform. I think there's a bit of a gray area. I'm thinking of one case, the roommates case, where this is very, very simple compared to technology the way we know it now, but basically it was a way to find roommates, and there was a drop down that said, what would you prefer? And some of the choices on the drop down were discriminatory. And so roommates tried to say, oh, hey, we're not discriminating, it's the user who chooses these choices. And I believe the decision came down, well, no, you gave them the false choice, the illegal choices. So in that case, I guess you can say the platform created the content that was a problem, but I extrapolate that to if you design a system that is inherently going to do certain things, it has nothing to do with content, that's conduct. Even, so that we need to deal with that in some way. And so this third case that I'm thinking of is when you use AI to target messages. So, something comes in, it's on the radar as something that's getting some engagement from users, and then an AI algorithm goes through and says, okay, who will be most impacted by, or most receptive to this content? And then and maybe it's horrible stuff, and there's a whole lot of people who are receptive to horrible stuff. Maybe it's false, maybe it's defamatory, but the AI algorithm decides to send it out to hundreds of thousands of people. In my mind, and I think this is probably controversial, but in my mind, that's the platform. That's on the platform, and I don't think Section 230 should protect it. But at this point, I would call that a maybe. I think it's I'm very aware that there's a Section 230 panel coming up after us, and I'm really excited to see it, and so maybe anything I say can be corrected. But yeah, I believe that's an open question right now.
So let me ask you about, you mentioned, Halie, the procedural question of, it should be considered through regular order. You've mentioned that it's very fact-specific, and Halie, you mentioned that as well. Is it your view that Congress should step in and, through regular order, figure out how Section 230 should apply to generative AI, or is it something you think we ought to leave for the courts to sort out, at least initially, and then see if Congress needs to step in? I'll ask you there.
I'll go.
Go.
Yeah. Okay, so I do have some thoughts on this, and sometimes I feel a little isolated because I'm not sure even my own team agrees with me. So I'm gonna, many of them don't. So I'm gonna just toss this out as my thinking on this subject, and again, the next panel will correct me. It seems to me that when I say that Section 230, its meaning has changed subtly over time. I think there were some assumptions that were made that were valid in the beginning that proved not to be over time. And one of them was this idea that if we just enable platforms to moderate, the market incentive of creating a decent place for mass communication will give them adequate incentive to do a good job. And there's always been sort of dark, creepy corners on the internet, but they're not commercially viable. And so we're going to rely on we're sort of taking the publisher out of the equation because, once you can publish to hundreds of thousands of people anonymously, I don't think that's ever been possible before. There's always, even though there's a right to anonymous communication, there has always been a publisher, and it's always been possible to find them. And now we have, a situation where there's basically no publisher. So the idea was, well, instead of relying on the laws that control publishing, we will rely on the market to get this right. And then unfortunately, I think what we saw with Frances Haugen revelations a few years ago was that actually there is a pretty strong commercial incentive to do bad things. And probably the canonical example is the pro-anorexia content that gets pumped out. It's super harmful, but it's very engaging. And so when you have an algorithm that says, what are people interested in? It's not always good stuff. It's bullying, it's political misinformation and propaganda. It's all these frequently terrible things. And so we can't necessarily rely on the market to keep, under Section 230 to keep things at a decent level. So then the second thing is what I mentioned earlier is create a situation where there is no publisher. And if we can't rely on the market to keep content, moderated, then we do need the laws that we had already established for publishers. But if the publisher can't be found or identified, and the Senate Intelligence Committee a couple of years ago verified that in fact foreign governments are actively publishing into our information space. So in my mind, we need to restore the publisher in some case. And so finally cutting to the chase here, I think that when a platform amplifies content, if they can't identify the publisher, then they are the publisher. And so what I'm saying is if there is verifiable provenance information in the media content that's being amplified, regardless of what it states as to who the source is or whether it's good content or what, as long as the platform can go, oh, this content claims to have a publisher, then in my book, they're off the hook. They're fine. They can have the Section 230 protection. But if they're just spamming out stuff that has no indication where it came from or what it is, and it ends up being harmful, I don't think it's right that they have this degree of protection. So I wouldn't take the protection away, but I would make it contingent on somebody being the publisher. And I think there are a lot of details to that. That's the reason we're still talking about this as opposed to trying to act on it. So I don't know if that's a good solution or not. It's one that I believe in, and I've now shared it.
Halie, your thoughts on should Congress step in, particularly on the generative AI issue?
So I'll take a step back because I work on AI broadly as well for the Commerce Committee, and I think when Congress talks about regulating AI, people are sometimes thinking about generative AI and kind of missing the fact that AI is much, much broader than just content generation. And so we are trying to sort that out, at least where we sit, and take a step back and say, hey, like AI is way, way bigger than ChatGPT. And in terms of the benefits that AI could construe on the economy and the quality of life in terms of productivity enhancements, et cetera, medical breakthrough, like we need to make sure that if we do regulate in any way, like we're not impeding innovation, we're not impeding potential advancements that can really, really help people, right? So I'm just gonna caveat with that. And then when you get into the generative AI space in terms of creation of content, that's a really that's a tough space in the First Amendment issues, right? So I think there's very, very little that Congress can or should do in terms of regulating the outputs of generative AI. You can talk about, I know there are proposals out there to try and regulate on the front end. I think that also gets into a tricky space with the First Amendment. The only place where our team has really put out a marker on this has been in the space of deepfake revenge pornography. And like I said earlier, we really did look to First Amendment jurisprudence when we were crafting that legislation. So, I mean, that's our view on it.
Okay, well, let's talk about outputs, because I think one of the debates we see over and over again right now in Congress is some kind of harmful output that's being created or exacerbated by generative AI, whether it's non-consensual images or the like, and a reaction that, oh, we should do something about it, but at the same time a recognition that, well, there are First Amendment issues around that. So one area that I know, Jacqui, your committee has looked at quite a bit is in the area of digital replicas of someone's voice or image, where we're trying to protect performers from having their image or their voice misappropriated, but at the same time, we want to protect the ability to do political memes, satire, other kinds of free speech. So we have bills like the No Fakes Act and other bills that are trying to walk that line. So talk a little bit about sort of what some of those bills do and how you all are thinking about the balance there.
Yeah, sure. We've had multiple hearings on this in our subcommittee, and it's something that we're thinking about on a regular basis, and regular meetings about this. And in the Senate, I believe it's draft legislation called the No Fakes Act, and in the House, there's a different proposal called the No AI Fraud Act. And both of them go after the same idea, which is a right of publicity at the federal level. And there are state rights of publicity, saying you own your own name, image, likeness, and this is adding in voice. Because before this, it was pretty hard to replicate someone's voice and have them say whatever you want. And now that, I mean, kids can log onto a program and do this. So it has, what you were saying, it has really interesting potential. I like to use the example of Billy Joel could record his new song in, with like Billy Joel from 20 years ago, using his voice from 20 years ago. You can train AI on that, and it's absolutely fascinating. But the potential for abuse, particularly in the intellectual property space, is vast. During our, I believe it was February 2nd hearing, field hearing in LA, Lainey Wilson, who's a country music star, testified and talked about how her not just her voice but her face was replicated in a video that was not her, to market some product, and how that, and she talked about the harm that she incurred. And so, on the other hand, any of these pieces of legislation need to be cognizant of fair use. And they're not copyright pieces, but I'm using fair use interchangeably with First Amendment, because we want to ensure that parity is still, that people can still, again, this is where I keep going back to fair use. That's not statutory, that's a judicially created doctrine that talks about, that is based in the First Amendment. So what rights do people have already under the First Amendment to, parity is a great example, but to provide commentary, et cetera.
Halie, if you want to jump in on this question of...
I'll just add, just from the Commerce Committee perspective, you had me thinking, because you were talking about the IP space, but the other kind of point that we try to emphasize to folks on the Hill when we're talking about potential regulation of generative AI is, where are there actually gaps in current law? Because the FTC already can go after fraud, for example, right? So if you clone, my voice and then send a voicemail to my grandma asking for $10,000 or whatever it is, that's fraud. That's already illegal, right? Same thing in employment discrimination, for example. The EEOC already regulates that space, and so it doesn't. The conduct is still unlawful, right? It doesn't matter if you use AI to discriminate or you do it on your own, it's still illegal to racially or race-based or sex-based discrimination in hiring is still illegal, right? So I think we have to think about where current law already provides a lot of coverage for unlawful conduct, regardless of whether or not AI plays a role in that. And then if there are gaps, and we've seen some, what's the best way to kind of close those loopholes?
John, any thoughts on the misappropriation?
Yeah, I've got a couple of random comments. I just made some notes here on things the others have said. One item is we are particularly focused on my team on the fake robocalls. And as Jacqui mentioned, it's really never been possible before to real-time generate a convincing imitation of a voice. And if I've never, this is not something I would do, so I don't actually know this, but I believe you can actually have a conversation where somebody says something to you and then you respond in real time in that voice. So it's a pretty powerful technology, and it's the Consumer Protection Subcommittee, if nothing else, we are all about preventing scams, and this is a super powerful one. And then in terms of the IP stuff, I just want to give a shout out to the Elvis Act from Tennessee, because I generally don't like acronyms in bill titles, but that was a good one. So yeah, there are a number of state laws, and I agree there should be a federal law for name, image, likeness. And then you mentioned the possibility of Billy Joel creating a new song. I'm not really a country music fan, but there is a Randy Travis video. I don't know if people have seen this. He had some medical issue, I believe a stroke or something, and he can't sing anymore. But they made a new song out of his voice, and it's moving. It's really, really incredible, in fact. It's realistic, and he totally authorized it, and he's proud of it. So it's really, there are very good positive uses for this. And then finally, Halie mentioned fraud, and I'm obsessed with this. I don't know how much real-world implication this has, but to me it's just a fascinating question. There are a certain set of laws, fraud being one of them, that rely on mens rea, the mental state, the intent. It's not fraud if you tell somebody something that's not true, but you had no intent to defraud them. You have to be trying to fool them. So, sort of a case I imagine is you could probably use AI to build a bot that would go out and shop on eBay and Amazon and then arbitrage. If something's cheap on eBay, you can buy it cheap and sell it on Amazon and so forth. And if you just direct the system to maximize revenue, how long before it starts writing fraudulent product reviews to try and bring a price down over here and bring a price up over here? Okay, well, it's capable, we've seen it do things like this, right? So now what you've done is I just built a machine to do arbitrage and make money, and I told it to do that. It kind of on its own figured out that it could now commit fraud. But where's the mens rea? I'd never told it to commit fraud. I was not even aware it was committing fraud. I just noticed it was doing some pretty good arbitrage work, and I was checking every day and making money. So I created the system. In no way did I intend for it to be fraudulent, but it was. So I think this is one of those cases where the law does need to step up, and I'm not exactly sure what to do about it. But it's definitely, existing laws do have some challenges now. In particular, mens rea is just fascinating to me, because we don't even know if the AI has. Maybe the AI does have a mind. These are really, really difficult questions, and for now we have to assume it doesn't. So.
Jacqui, you look like you wanted to weigh in.
Oh, I was just going to say this is a great advertisement for my hearing this Wednesday, which will be on this topic.
Okay. So another type of harmful image, and Halie, you've already mentioned a couple of times, that can be created using generative AI are non-consensual intimate images. So different from child sexual abuse material, which is inherently illegal because of the age of the person being portrayed. Here, it's the non-consensual part that is particularly important. The NCII causes clear harms, but there are also free expression issues at stake here. Senator Cruz recently introduced the Take It Down Act, which would criminalize certain activity related to NCII. Another prominent bill is the Defiance Act, which would create a civil cause of action. Talk to us a little bit about what those bills would do and how you're thinking about balancing, on the one hand, dealing with the real harms these kinds of issues cause versus how do we protect free expression at the same time?
Right, so the Take It Down Act does a few different things. So First, it federally criminalizes publication of real revenge porn. So if someone, which is already unlawful in 48 states. So just closing that gap, I think, is clear. And then it criminalizes the publication of AI-generated or computer-generated revenge porn of adults and non-consensual intimate images of minors. So we created in the Take It Down Act a reasonable person test for whether or not that image includes an identifiable individual and whether or not a reasonable person would think that image is essentially real or that video is essentially real, right? So in that way, we are kind of exempting from coverage, obviously virtual, obviously fake, cartoon, humor, et cetera. There are also some carve-outs for like disclosures to law enforcement, et cetera. We also were careful to only criminalize publication, not creation or distribution. And then threats to publish is also criminalized because sextortion schemes are very much on the rise and are a huge concern in the victims' rights community. And so we are seeing an explosion of this, particularly NCII generated of minors, and it's happening in high schools across the country. We have a case tracker. There are cases, victims coming out of the woodwork every single day. It's horrifying. So when we introduced the legislation last week, we had a Houston 15-year-old girl that had been targeted by a male classmate along with some of her friends, and she was speaking on the bill along with her mother. She will be testifying on Wednesday at our field hearing along with another 15-year-old girl from New Jersey who had the same exact thing happen to her and her friend group, completely different states, in October of last year. And these images are like on the internet potentially forever, and the perpetrators are not really facing consequences. And so we think it's really important to have federal coverage for this behavior so that it is disincentivized going forward. The second piece of the Take It Down Act is somewhat novel compared to Defiance and SHIELD, which are the other two big bills in this space, and we see them all as complementary. Senator Klobuchar who is the sponsor of the SHIELD Act, is our co-lead on Take It Down. We create a notice and takedown requirement for websites, covered platforms. There's a definition in the bill, so it's a little bit more narrow than the criminal side of the bill. They would have to have in place a process to receive reports from victims and then make a decision, act on that report within 48 hours, and that part is enforced by the FTC. This is modeled after the DMCA, copyright notice and takedown provision. So, we've gotten some good feedback on that provision, and people have different thoughts on it. So we'll keep working on it. But in general, especially the big social media websites, they purport to not allow this content, but then victims have no way to get in touch with them, and they're like, well, just report it. And it's like, they can't see the content. Like, they're just hearing about it. It's happening in Snapchat group chats. They're not like viewing it and able to click the button to report it. So they need to have in place a better intake process for these families, because in the case of the Houston victim, the mother was trying to call Snapchat for 8 months, and then I emailed them and it was down in 24 hours. So they can take it down.
Jacqui, you want to weigh in on this issue at all?
So from an intellectual property perspective, this has come up. This is not specifically the issue of deepfakes altogether. And so again, this goes back once again to this name, image, likeness, voice, because we think of it in application to famous people. The examples we both used were of people who make money off of their voices. But what happens when it is a high school student from New Jersey or Texas? And quite frankly, where is the law not acting? And I think we're getting into the criminal zone, but the idea of having there being an inherent right in your face in some way, where is the line there, is I think a question that we're trying to draw, because there's clearly like inappropriate behavior where that should not, I think everyone agrees that should not be allowed. And so where is the line for what is, oh, this is someone just expressing themselves and using AI to create something new, versus where is it harming individuals and not contributing to the intellectual property of our society?
John, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, thank you. The Cruz team dropped this bill a couple days ago. I was prepping for this panel, and it occurred to me it might come up. And so obviously I read the bill very carefully, and that is basically what I do for a living. I didn't just read the bill to prepare for this conference. I read the bill because it's my job. And so since this is the view from Congress, I think I will just walk through some of my margin notes and then toss it over to Halie to respond.
Are you guys going to co-sponsor it?
Pardon?
You going to co-sponsor it?
If you answer the questions well.
Okay.
Live negotiations on stage.
So yeah, this is the world we live in here. And first of all, I really want to be emphatic. I think it's a fantastic bill. I'm really glad they did it. I'm glad it's bipartisan. I'm glad it's strong. This is something that is, sometimes we talk about, AI. We need to just, let innovation run free because, we don't want to second guess anything. The trouble is there are people who come up with some really bad ideas, and this isn't one that I thought of, but somebody did, and you can use AI to do terrible things to just an ordinary picture of someone, and so we have to deal with that. So again, just very strong endorsement of the bill. I like it. But here are the margin notes I wrote as I was going through, going, what about this? What about this? These are all nits. One is, well, maybe not. I am not a big fan of civil forfeiture. Let me hold your applause till the end. In every case, there's probably a very good reason for it. Whenever I run into civil forfeiture, I'm a little apprehensive, so I hope there's good reason for that, and I'd love to hear it. What else have we got here? The 48-hour takedown, I totally get that because these things spread as fast as, like wildfire. And I love the fact that when someone from Congress calls, they do respond. Unfortunately,
at least they respond, yes. But.
Yeah, we can't do that all day long, unfortunately.
Right,
But
yep.
if we could, we would, and maybe that would solve the problem. So the problem with the 48 hours, though, is it's really hard, like in particular the one I forget which one of you mentioned it, but it's the, I know it's out there, but I can't even find it. Right, I just know it's out there. Okay, for someone to go, okay, well, we'll drop everything and go find it, and we'll find all of them, and we'll get rid of them, and don't worry about it. Within 48 hours, on a scale where you have billions of users, that is really hard to do. So my assumption is this is going to strongly bias towards takedown. And in my mind, personally, that doesn't bother me too much, but at the principle level, which is, we're going to make a very strong incentive to limit speech in ways that aren't necessary. That bothers me. Again, I see the other side, and we've all talked about balance. We don't get easy questions, so we have to balance here. And so I'm just sort of saying the 48-hour rule seems really tight. I understand why it is, but it also creates this competing incentive. There's the matter of public concern, I guess it's called, and my understanding of that is if someone is harmed by a deep fake and it becomes very public, at a certain point you want like a journalist to be able to go, okay, here's why we know this is fake. So here's the video that's out there, here are the telltale signs it's fake, and so we really want to exonerate the person who's supposedly implicated in this video in some way. And so I totally get that, but on the other hand, I would be very cautious about what constitutes a matter of public interest. There was a few years ago a political candidate who got into a dispute with a woman and then tweeted out that she was a horrible person and you should go find her sex tape. Does that make it a matter of public concern? If it's a leading, well-known political candidate who does that? Maybe. It turns out there actually wasn't one. So it was, I don't know if that makes it better or worse. It was a deliberate lie, but it occurs to me now that there are a few additional things that kind of come off of that. One of them is inciting revenge porn, because now anybody who says, oh, this person doesn't like this person, and maybe I should go create a video and get it circulated. And also, maybe there really is a video out there, and maybe it's pretty much suppressed. It's off all the major platforms. It's just in a couple of these dark, creepy corners. But once somebody calls attention to it, boom, it's out everywhere, all over again. The whole thing starts again. So I think the situation with the kids in Texas, I don't think that is like deliberately harmful revenge porn. It is very harmful, but it is not an attempt to deliberately harm someone. But the scenarios that I'm talking about apply where someone really is trying to harm someone. So these may seem a little far-fetched, but there are ways around this law if you are really focused on creating harm. So we'll pass it back to you just quickly. I was talking about civil forfeiture, the 48 hours being a little tight. Matter of public concern needs to be narrowly limited. And then what about linking and inciting and just encouraging bad things?
Yeah. I like that you called it a law, so we're manifesting here today.
It's bipartisan.
It's very bipartisan. No, these are good notes. Some of the, and I'll just caveat that we harmonize the text with the SHIELD Act negotiations and Judiciary. So that's where some of the provisions came from, including the civil forfeiture. So we can talk about that offline. But I mean, I think the point is well taken in terms of having in terms of the public interest. I think that, these are things we would love to negotiate on. We have heard similar feedback on the 48-hour piece. I think it's something that, frankly, the big tech companies could actually handle pretty easily at scale. Having worked on the inside, I mean, this is a really drop in the bucket amount of content compared to what they can auto-moderate on a daily basis. And a lot of the biggest content types tend to be like spam and actual pornography. Soon it's all going to be deepfake pornography, and so once that's depicting real people, we're going to have a problem. But I would disagree with you on the harm in the cases of these girls. I think the harm is intrinsic to your image, an image of you that looks very realistic but is fake, and it's.
I'm not contesting the harm. I need to be really clear.
Okay.
Just the intent is what I was.
Yeah, but there was intent in these cases. So the boys that were spreading it were continuing to do it for months, and I am not going to repeat the account names that were used in the Texas case, but very, very clearly not remorseful. It wasn't a one-time mistake and they took the image down. We have seen that happen in some cases. In these cases, it's bullying that's happening in high schools, and unfortunately middle schools can also happen to adults as well. And so it actually is the dark, creepy corners that we want to get at, because I do think the social media companies, for the most part, don't want this content spreading on their platforms, especially if this were to pass and it would then be illegal content, classified as obscenity, and therefore not subject to First Amendment protections is what we're going for here. Understand that will have to be litigated at some point. But there are 9,000 plus websites that are just dedicated to hosting revenge pornography. And so I would love to send Lena Khan after them. I think that would be a great use of her time.
So how are you, just want to press you a little bit on the First Amendment and free expression implications, particularly because when you're talking about the takedowns, there's no court involvement or no court determination at all. And I think John's right that the incentive is going to be just take the stuff down. Every incentive that the provider is going to have is just to take it down and not to leave it up. And so curious sort of how you're thinking about maintaining some, understanding a lot of this is horrid content, creates real harm, no doubt about that at all. But how do you still at the same time make sure it doesn't overstep and start getting into protected?
Yeah, so the FTC enforces the process side of this, right? So do you have in place a process that is responsive to the victim when he or she puts in a request? Are you actually acknowledging that request and taking action one way or the other? The bill also does require some information from the victim, like basically a statement that this was non-consensual, this was published non-consensually, I am the person in this image, and a signature. So it's not like a free-for-all where you could, I think you're trying to get to potentially the point of brigading, where people could go in and report content repeatedly to try and get it taken down. This is a really narrow sliver of content, it really is. And so I get that there is a balancing act. And yeah, maybe platforms do at sometimes err on the side of caution. A lot already ban pornography. Twitter's an exception here. And so this is where we know there's a line. This is where we're trying to draw it. And we did look to the Miller test as well, just to make sure we were hitting all those 3 prongs in drafting this. So again, open to feedback on it. We would, of course, love to mark it up at some point. And so I'm sure there will be opportunities to amend. And I think everyone's raising really good points and edge cases that should be discussed,
So we were talking about NCII and the effect on teenagers in particular, but more generally, the question of kids and kids' safety online has been a huge topic of conversation throughout this Congress. And one of the complicating issues when you're talking about Kids Online Safety Act and some of the other bills has been this question of how do we protect kids on the one hand while at the same time preserving the rights, particularly of teenagers, to access information, to be able to speak, to be able to build community. And this has been sort of an ongoing discussion, and it affects generative AI as well, because a lot of these are algorithm or AI algorithm. A lot of the bills are trying to target AI algorithms that try to recommend or content and the like. So Jacqui, do you want to step in a little bit and talk a little bit about this question of how do we protect kids, but at the same time protect particularly teenagers' free expression rights?
No, certainly. And I think that, so to the extent that some of these bills, it's possible my other panelists are better suited to answer questions about some of the online content moderation, because that is not within my subcommittee. However, but I think that some of the questions about the creation of these deepfake images, et cetera. I think that I was talking with one of my crime colleagues a few months ago, and she pointed out that for child pornography, it has to be a real child, which is under the statute, which brings up a really interesting problem of when an AI program is creating children that don't exist. Is it still child pornography? I would argue yes. And so that's a really interesting problem that we're going to have to face. I think that as we have these conversations about deepfakes, we're just in uncharted waters. And I think that talking about FTC enforcement and thinking about and how to regulate this is something that I think everybody should be focused on and be thinking very seriously about. And I don't think, on the other hand, when we're writing legislation, I don't think that painting with a broad brush to say, okay, no one can do this ever, speaking about creation of generated images, not about non-consensual sexual images. I think that obviously AI has very, very, especially, and generative AI specifically, has very practical applications in many fields. And this is simply, how do you make sure that what is created isn't harming other people's individual rights?
So John, the Commerce Committee has been considering a lot of these kids' bills, COSA and others, and dealing with this question of how do we balance free expression versus protecting kids. Your thoughts on these issues?
Yeah, so we've actually passed COSA, the Kids Online Safety Act. We have passed COSA, the Kids Online Safety Act, twice out of the Commerce Committee. It is a very, very difficult bill. It has been in my life for 2.5 years, I believe. It came out of the Frances Haugen hearings, which were really, really got a lot of attention, and it was a response to that. I also see it as a response to the frustration we've all had with comprehensive privacy. Really, the solution is comprehensive privacy, I think. I should clarify, COSA is a safety bill, and then there's COPPA 2.0, which is a follow-up on the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act from 1999. Yes, thank you. Those two are kind of paired. We refer to them as the kids' bills. But they're very controversial, COSA in particular. my sense is that due to frustration with the comprehensive privacy, I think, and some of the revelations about how seriously harmful the platforms can be to kids, there was this idea, well, let's just narrow our focus and let's take care of kids. Everybody loves kids. There's not going to be a problem here. Regrettably, it's true. Everybody does love kids. And the problems with privacy were not because people didn't care. It was because we had serious issues that were really difficult to resolve. And so when you say, oh, let's just narrow this down to kids, and everybody loves kids, so we're all going to get together and fix this, it actually just intensified the debate. It didn't make it easier by narrowing it. And then secondly, by addressing privacy and safety at the same time, it may not be obvious, but the deeper you get into it, the more you realize they're in opposition, right? So privacy says, okay, we're not going to collect any more information than we need. Safety says, we need to know if everybody's a kid or not, so give us your credit card number. Those are in conflict, right? So I think a lot of people, maybe I'm only talking about myself, maybe I sort of thought, hey, we're gonna narrow this, we're gonna take care of kids, everybody wants to take care of kids, let's get this done. I'm slightly optimistic that, that the fact that we all do love kids is gonna win, but basically the debate just got more intense and the motivation to be successful got more intense. So when it comes right down to it, I do support COSA very frankly reluctantly because of some of the issues. In particular, it puts kids in a situation where they may not have access to information that would be extremely valuable to them, particularly older kids, which is why it sort of distinguishes between little kids and teenagers and adults. But I think the problem is extremely serious and the challenges in the law are also extremely serious. So when we talk about balancing, this is a high wire act and it's been going on way too long. So I hope we can resolve it, but it's just a difficult question.
So I want to switch topics a little bit and talk a little bit about generative AI in elections, because this is another area in which there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of pending bills, and questions about whether the creation of deep fakes about candidates or about the easy spread of disinformation and misinformation about the time, place, and manner of voting, for example, whether generative AI will cause an increase in that. And obviously this is an election year here, it's an election year in many places around the world. And so, Halie, I might want to start with you and talk a little bit about your thoughts on sort of generative AI in elections, what, if anything, Congress should be doing here, while at the same time recognizing that political speech has always been thought of as the highest, the most protected form of speech under the First Amendment, and how do we balance that against the potential harms from generative AI?
This is a very loaded topic, so thanks for letting me go first. I think this is a pretty partisan topic right now in Congress, to be honest. In terms of, purposely trying to mislead people about time, place, manner of voting, that's a little bit more straightforward. I would imagine it wouldn't matter if you use Gen AI or just a post you wrote in order to do that. Of course, the issue with generative AI and AI generally is the scope, right, and how quickly you can scale that. But the elections bills that we've been seeing in this space, other than the transparency-related ones, I think have been, I believe, party line votes. At least correct me if I'm wrong. I didn't actually fully check all the votes from the Rules Committee markup the other week, but Senator Cruz was, voted against the two that would regulate generative AI in election-related content. And then I did notice that the House has it's because I was working on the deepfake revenge pornography bill, but the House has a bill led by Representative Morelli that has become extremely imbalanced in terms of co-sponsorship, and I think it's because there's an elections-related provision in the bill that's supposed to be banning deepfake NCII of children, and it heightens the penalty to 10 years if the deepfake affects an election. I don't really know why they included that in the bill. It seems a little bit off topic because we're trying to protect kids and real victims of this conduct, and so that was just weird to me, and I imagine that's why it got partisan. But yes, a lot of election-related content is protected speech, and so I think will be very difficult to regulate in this area. Obviously, there are election-related rules that I am not an expert in at all. So I don't know if either of you have done election law at all, but.
Jacqui, your thoughts?
So agreed that it is these days a partisan issue, but I think one area where it is relatively bipartisan, on our subcommittee, we've had 3 hearings on the intellectual property threat from China. And while we may disagree about some of the blurry edges, I think that most artificial intelligence experts would agree that China is ahead of us for image generating capabilities for artificial intelligence, and that has huge ramifications for our upcoming election. And I think that's something that it's important that we're all aware of. So I'm not sure, I think it was last August when the Maui wildfire happened. I believe I'm pretty sure I'm right here, that Hawaii, so Hawaii had the wildfires, and images generated from China were put out on the internet, basically saying that the wildfires were an inside job. And I don't know how much it took off. I don't know how much it was believed. I will say I think that it was very, very quickly covered by journalists saying, hey, this is artificial intelligence. This is a great example of a deep fake. But these were just a few images. And I think about how far we've come in the last year as far as how quickly the technology is improved. So this is huge ramifications for our elections. I don't have this is the solution for this. I more think that it's better to first understand the threat. And I think that the more people are aware that any image they see that they should do some cross-referencing, especially some sort of explosive, I don't even want to go down the hypotheticals route. But I think awareness is the first step here for the general public. And I think that educating everyone about exactly what can come out is a good way to start the conversation for what do we do about it in the future, because it isn't like this problem's going to go away.
John?
Yes, thank you. We are getting the high sign, so this might be the last question before we go to audience. I'm going to go ahead and assert that maybe election protection from propaganda and so forth is maybe more bipartisan than it seems. And thinking of the speed with which the TikTok bill came out of the House and landed on the president's desk. I remember getting a call from someone saying, what's the deal with this TikTok bill? And I'm like, there's a TikTok bill? So it moved very rapidly, and I think basically everyone realized that China is using TikTok in a very unfair way to manipulate, our discourse and in particular our elections. And I can give you a really good example. And when I say this is bipartisan, this is a case of me going, oh, okay, I kind of fell for something, and it was something I wanted to believe. And once I realized there was a strong possibility it wasn't true, I kind of had to accept that, I had been played. And what I'm talking about, and you may recall this, it was almost exactly 4 years ago. President Trump had a major rally in Tulsa, I believe, and there were free tickets available online, and they were bragging that they were selling hundreds of thousands of tickets or giving away or whatever. And so they created this whole outdoor overflow area with a band and a stage and everything. And then as the day showed up, like 90% of the people who had tickets didn't show up, and they had to close down the outdoor stage, and it was an embarrassment for them. And I remember just kind of laughing. What had happened is all these kids on TikTok were signing up for tickets with no intention of going. And the Trump campaign kind of fell for it, and I thought it was funny. And that was it. It was only in retrospect that I'm like, wait a minute, how do millions of people suddenly get this same idea to do this? Maybe it was organic. I'd like to think it was, but maybe it was manipulated. Maybe it was TikTok flexing their muscles, right? So at the time, I thought it was cute. I thought it was funny. I thought it was a win. I was really happy with it. In retrospect, I'm embarrassed that I didn't actually think about the possibility that it was engineered. And so I think, one of the sort of truisms in Congress is if you're going after China, we all seem to agree. And that's how TikTok got through. But I think we need to broaden our focus. There's Russia, there's Iran, there's North Korea, there's all these countries. And frankly, our back door is wide open. You know, they can just walk into our discourse and do anything they want. In particular, our elections are fragile and threatened. And I think we desperately need to do something. I support the bills that have come out of the Rules Committee. I generally do not support labeling laws, and that's what at least one of them is saying, is that if you're using AI in an election act or an election message, you do need to make that clear. I think over time, we're going to mature and realize that just because something's a video doesn't mean it's true. But we're in this stage right now where people are going to fall for it in mass quantities, and I think we need to recognize that and do something about it. If I may brag about my home state of Washington, we do have a bill that has done this. It's in force. Unfortunately, the bills came out of the Rules Committee at the federal level will not take effect for this election. So on the federal level, we're on our own. And Washington, it'll be interesting to see what happens there. So that's my thoughts.
I do want to turn to the audience, but before I do that, wanted to give the panelists any last remarks, any topics we didn't hit on that you wanted to cover or anything like that before we turn to the audience.
This is a bit off topic but I will say that one area where I think that my subcommittee is focusing on is and for the record, there's no legislation out there right now, but is the question of use of copyrighted material as training data and whether or not that is considered fair use, which is, again, a First Amendment doctrine. So right now, I would argue that it's with the courts right now, but whether or not Congress needs to act in the future is something that I think people are keeping an eye on. I think that these generative AI is powered, in many cases, by copyrighted material, and how we do that, and whether or not it is allowed under fair use is, I think, an open question.
Okay, great. So audience, we've covered a lot of ground. Anyone who wants to ask questions can just come up to the mic.
Thank you. Is it on? Okay.
Yep.
This is a great panel. My name is Cameron Powell. I'm the head of AI at Hold On Law. You just brought up what I was going to ask about, which is inputs. A lot of people are understandably outraged that their work product, their human genius, is being scraped. It's being monetized. Money's being made off of it, maybe even in competition with the creator. But there is, I think, a hole in the copyright law because what's being copied is not copyrightable material. What they're doing is they're looking at the relationships, statistical relationships among the words, and that is not protected expression. So if it's a hole in copyright law, but it is creating value for the LLMs, is there any discussion about creating some mechanism that is an analog to copyright law that perhaps protects this or provides for some kind of, Adam Schiff talking about at least showing the provenance of where this stuff is from so we can start from there. And maybe at some point, maybe using blockchain, it becomes compensable. But I'm just curious if there's, what the level of discussion is around that.
Jacqui, I'll let you jump in.
Sure. So I don't think that we're at the point of having discussions about creating a separate area of the law necessarily. I will say I think reasonable minds can differ as to whether or not it is per se allowed under copyright law as it currently exists. I will say it also could take 10 years for it to work its way through the court system. And 10 years from now, I think we all agree that AI and generative AI is going to look very, very different. I think that some of the do not train proposals are really interesting. You mentioned the Adam Schiff proposal. And the number of companies that have come to meet with me have said, oh, well, we're using do not train. And the idea that a copyright holder is going to be able to say, okay, now I'm going to go and I'm going to make sure every single website is labeled do not train to ensure that my material is not ingested, including websites where the the data is really scraped. So like, I mean, like think of the lyrics websites. You have the, official, I'm sure, songwriter website. And then you have, the one where it's already, just copied lyrics and you can kind of scroll through. And so this, right now there's no easy answer, I would say. And I think that that many argue that, oh, well, this is fair use anyway, so it shouldn't matter. And I think that, and so I would more stress, rather than taking a side on this, that it is an open question, and the idea that this is a throwaway issue, this doesn't matter, I think is underestimating the situation. Meta considered buying Simon & Schuster to train their AI models. There is clear economic value in the artist work that is being ingested, and I think that we would be unwise to forget that.
Other questions from the audience?
Very fascinating. We did a similar event to this in Brussels in March, and it's fair to say that the regulatory mood there is somewhat different to the mood expressed by you. Brussels likes to be a first mover on digital regulation, both on social media, but now also with AI, and that has a much more profound impact on speech. Of course, partly because speech protections in the European Union and in its member states is less, sets a lower bar than the First Amendment. But it also, when I listen to debates in this country, I hear lawmakers, but also increasingly First Amendment experts and others who sort of say, well, maybe they're onto something in Europe, and maybe we need to move away from sort of our commitment to free speech exceptionalism in the U.S. So is that something that you feel? Is there an appetite in Congress of sort of saying we need to adopt a more European model and maybe push the boundaries of what has seen as acceptable regulation impacting speech? Or do you see are there developments in Congress to sort of say, well, this is dangerous because now the EU is setting rules that indirectly impact the practical exercise of speech in Americans in ways that undermine our free speech ideals?
I think this is probably easiest for me to answer as the token conservative on the panel, but I don't think Europe is onto anything in this space, and generally, we're big supporters of the First Amendment in the Cruz office, and we already have like the record right from Europe's approach to regulation, which is really a precautionary principle, and there's a reason that they don't have nearly as many successful internet companies as the United States, and that's because they took a precautionary principle approach to regulating the internet. In the early 2000s in the US did the opposite, and we have the record for that. I think it's very clear who came out first in that race, and that's why they're now trying to regulate our internet companies, and it's frustrating. So that's my piece.
John, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I guess as the entitled liberal on the panel, I have never heard anyone say we need to be more like Europe, for what it's worth. In fact, honestly, I think we should make every effort to harmonize. I don't think we should be just like Europe, but I have been through I guess we're on our third round of what I think of as privacy shield discussions, but I think we threw out privacy shields 2 years ago, and we threw out whatever replaced it about 6 months ago, and I think we've fixed it, but maybe. What I'm getting at is that the GDPR, the European privacy law, required certain, basically what's called an adequacy decision before data could be sent from Europe to the US, and we do not meet their adequacy standards. So technically, under the law, they can't send data to the US, which is catastrophic for a number of businesses, so they have created a patchwork of solutions that keeps getting thrown out in court. So I don't want to have to go through that indefinitely forever. So we should definitely be aware of what they're doing and attempt to align with it as much as possible. I guess just to toss something out, and this might be a little too in the weeds, so I'll just go through it quickly, just about how I literally think about the bill, or the act. I tried to read it. I read about half of it. It was a 700-page bill. It's massive. And they do go into detail. But I'm going to do the opposite and just speak very broadly. They're attempting to categorize different types of AI. I believe they have 5 categories. The top category is do not do this under any circumstance. Then category number 2 is, this is really risky, you need to be careful. Category number 3 is, not so bad, watch what you're doing, but this is routine. Category number 2 is, number 4 is, this AI and everything, but there's no risk. And then finally, the other category is, there's no AI here at all, this is not a risk, right? So, I'm playing this mental game where I literally, when I sit down with stakeholders in particular who want to have different categories, I say, I am defaulting to the fewest possible categories to keep this as simple as possible. You have to convince me otherwise. So I see 3 categories, dangerous, moderate, and not dangerous, instead of 5. And then I am trying to remember exactly what the categories of actors are in the bill, or in the act, and I do not recall exactly. I would like it to be developers and deployers on our side. I think they have like 4 or 5 categories, including users and intermediaries. I'm not sure on this, so forgive me. But my attitude is, let's be aware of what they're doing. Let's kind of follow the model, but let's do everything in our power to simplify and keep it simpler. So that's how I'm looking at it.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience, if anyone wants to ask. Yep.
Good morning, and thank you for the insightful panel. I'm a student at Vanderbilt. My name is Jason, and obviously we spent a lot of time discussing sort of mitigating the risks of AI. I'm curious if any of you can speak to the priority Congress is placing on investing in AI research, both in terms of making AI better from a free speech perspective, but also in implementing AI into the federal government and into the workforce and economy. Thank you.
I can speak a little to that. About 4 or 5 months ago, I committed to track every AI bill on the Hill. God. So I've been partially successful. My count is somewhere around 100, and that's introduced bills. There's several more that are not. And I committed to read all of them, and I have not read all of them. And regrettably, there is a limit, and they all kind of blur. I'm very aware there's safety legislation out there. There's safety legislation that I think is already passed. There's safety provisions in the executive order that came out. So safety is definitely a priority, and research to support it. In terms of my own office, it's kind of adjacent to what you're talking about. We are mostly focused on sort of very small kind of tactical moves, things like supporting responsible innovation, providing resources for training and stuff to overcome predicted workforce impacts that I think we need to be ready for. So the short answer is yes. I think all of safety and all sorts of related topics are definitely a matter of concern, and I think we'll see action on those. I don't think they're super controversial, but maybe they are.
And I think if you look at Senator Schumer's
I think they're
roadmap,
controversial.
but if you look at the roadmap that the bipartisan Gang of 4 in the Senate put out, there was a lot in there about investment in research and development and the like. There's the Create AI Act and certain other pieces of legislation. Yeah, Halie?
I think Congress is suffering a little bit from a hammer-nail problem where there's like a shiny object and then let's regulate it or throw money at it. And what we need to remember is there is a ton of investment right now in AI in the private sector. The US is outpacing the rest of the world in that sense. Like we've crunched the numbers. The Python code just broke, so I don't have the newest ones, but it's really remarkable. And that's because we have a good climate here for innovation. People want to come here and build. And so my concern with any of these bills that have regulatory components is that, understanding that Create AI is a little bit different, but is that we could be entrenching the biggest players in the game and making it a lot harder for all of these innovative startups to be competing. And that's why you now see, the venture capitalists that are investing in these startups, like Y Combinator, now coming to DC and meeting with lawmakers because they're concerned that we're going to, end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater if we get too far ahead of ourselves here. And so, someone's going to win the AI race. Right now, the U.S. is in the lead, but if we, overregulate our own industry, it could be China. And that is a very, very scary thought if you look at how they've already deployed AI against their own population, particularly the Uyghur community. And so I don't want to live in that world where we're not the leader and where our allies are not leading in AI development.
Any final thoughts from Jacqui or John before we close out?
I think that's an interesting point. As we talk about regulations or federal legislation, I think that's something that, just speaking for myself, I think about as we consider what the next steps are. I think that taking reasonable steps and reasoned steps makes the most sense. Not that we should, and I think that knee-jerk reactions legislatively are usually a bad idea. But I also think that just absolutely not acting can have huge ramifications. So I think that as we think about AI legislation, what is most important is that if we are creating any type of structure, that it is an elastic structure that doesn't basically, that isn't antiquated by the time it becomes law. AI, one of my favorite AI fun facts is most AI experts agree that they have no idea where AI is in advancement because it is advancing so quickly. And so as we write legislation, it has to be elastic, that it can accommodate future iterations of generative AI that, quite frankly, we at the current moment can't imagine. And so, not that we shouldn't act, but that we should act reasonably.
John, I'll give you the final word.
Not much to add, just real privilege to be on this panel with these panelists and you, and with this audience, so thank you very much.
And join me in thanking the panelists.
Yeah, I was fishing for that.